She carried the potatoes first, not blankets, not the lantern oil she would need before the week was out, not the wool coat she had seen hanging unclaimed in the trapper's shed 2 miles east of town. She carried potatoes because 3 weeks of sleeping in other people's cold had taught her something that no one in Hollis Gap had ever thought to put in words. Cold made a person slow. Cold made a person miserable and stupid and mean. But hunger reached into a different place entirely. Hunger found the room where decisions lived and put out the lights one by one quietly without announcement, until a person stood in the middle of a road staring at nothing and could not remember which direction led to shelter. Varity Vance had stood in that road on the third morning. She had felt the lights going out, and the terror of that blankness, that perfect white silence inside her own skull, had frightened her more than any cold ever could. So she carried the potatoes first. The trail up the eastern slope of the ridge was not a trail at all. It was a suggestion, a series of places where the rock happened to be lower than the rock beside it, where a person who was determined enough and frightened enough might find footing if they studied the ground carefully and committed to each step before they took it. The sack across her shoulders weighed 60 pounds. The sleet came at an angle, tapping against the stone faces above her with a sound like fingernails worried against a lid. She slipped twice on the way up. The second time she felt the full weight of the sack shift, felt the rope burn through her palms, felt 60 pounds of her future lurch toward the dark slope below. Her fingers closed on the rope without thinking. Her shoulders screamed. The muscle across her back went to fire. But she held on, braced against the rock, breathing in short, hard gasps, while the sack swung gently below her and the sleet found every gap at her collar and her wrists. She held on because holding on was the only skill she had left that she trusted completely. When she reached the ledge, she set the sack down against the stone and turned and looked at the valley below. Hollis Gap spread out in the early dark like a scatter of coals. Small orange lights in small windows, wood smoke rising from a dozen chimneys and dissolving into the low gray sky. 200 souls, more or less. A church whose steeple leaned a few degrees off true. A general store. A blacksmith's forge. The skeleton of a copper mine that had once kept the whole valley breathing and was now half dead, its best years spent, and the men who had given those years scattered to better promises or laid in the ground where the promises could no longer reach them. Varity looked at those lights for a long moment. Then she turned her back on them and dragged the sack through the narrow crack in the rock and into the dark. This is where the story really begins. Not on the slope, not on the trail. Here in the telling of how a girl of 17 came to be carrying potatoes up a frozen hillside in the first place. And for that, you need to go back 3 weeks, to a kitchen, to a table, to a sheet of paper and a man who believed that numbers were a kind of god. Harlon Holt did not shout. That was the part that stayed with Varity in the weeks that followed, the part that woke her in the cold dark of the cave and sat with her until morning. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam a door or sweep a plate from the table or say anything that could be called by any reasonable measure cruel. He simply set a sheet of paper on the wood between them and waited for her to read it. The handwriting was careful. Columns of figures in dark ink. Flour, salt, lamp oil, firewood, dried meat running down the left side. On the right, a count of mouths against a count of weeks until thaw. At the bottom, a subtraction. The kind of subtraction that left no room for argument because it was not a judgment. It was arithmetic. And beside the column of names, one name had been struck through with a single clean line. Varity Vance. There is not enough, he told her. His voice was the voice of a man reading a bill of sale. Not enough wood, not enough room, not enough of anything to carry 4 people through a Wyoming winter that was shaping up to be worse than the last 3 combined. The figures do not lie, he said. I am not asking you to leave. I am showing you why someone has to. Varity looked then to her mother. Dorothy Vance sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded in her lap and her gaze fixed somewhere on the floorboards between them. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the fabric of her skirt. Her lips pressed together in a line so thin it looked like something carved rather than something living. Varity waited. 1 word from her mother would have been enough. 1 syllable, 1 breath of objection, and she would have fought to stay. She would have argued the numbers back, would have offered to eat half portions, would have slept in the barn or the cellar or the woodshed. She would have found a way to make herself small enough to fit inside whatever space remained. But you cannot fight for a door that no one is holding open for you. And Dorothy's lips moved once without sound, and then her jaw set, and then the moment passed like weather and was gone. Verity understood even then that her mother was not heartless. She understood that 3 brutal winters and a husband buried and a marriage entered out of pure desperation had hollowed Dorothy out until silence was the only currency she had left. Understanding it did not make it hurt 1 degree less. She packed what 2 canvas sacks would hold. A change of clothes, the wool shawl her father had given her the winter she turned 12, a folding knife with a bone handle worn smooth where his thumb had rested against it 10,000 times, a handful of coins saved from mending other people's torn things, and a small leather pouch holding a lock of Gideon Vance's hair cut before they closed the lid on him. She was at the door when she noticed the drawer. Harlon had moved to the far side of the kitchen, his back to her, refilling his coffee cup with the deliberate movements of a man who has already filed the necessary paperwork and considered the matter closed. The drawer of his writing desk sat open an inch, the way a drawer sits when a man has pulled something out in a hurry and pushed it back without looking. Verity would not have glanced at it, would not have stopped, except that the edge of a document protruded from the gap and she recognized the letterhead. Consolidated Wyoming Copper, the company that had owned the mine. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. Harlon did not turn. She pulled the drawer open and lifted the document into the light from the window. It was a contract, dated spring of 1880. Authorization for extended excavation in the Eastern Tunnel Complex signed by the site supervisor and countersigned by the company's regional manager. The signatures at the bottom of the page ran in a column foreman and shift supervisors, and finally near the bottom in the careful dark ink she had just watched produce a column of figures on a dinner table, the name Harlon Holt. She read the addendum at the bottom of the page, the one that authorized the crews to proceed below the surveyed safe depth in exchange for increased extraction targets. The one that made the Eastern Tunnels collapse in the spring of 1881, not an accident of geology, but a predictable consequence of a decision someone had made and signed his name to. The Eastern Tunnel where 4 men had died. One of them was Gideon Vance. Verity stood in Harlon Holt's kitchen holding the proof that the man had not simply failed her father, but had signed his name to the order that killed him. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not grief and was not rage, but was something beneath both of those, something older and quieter and more certain than either. She folded the document carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat against her ribs, next to the leather pouch with the lock of her father's hair. Harlon did not turn. She picked up her sacks and walked out the door before sunset. She did not say goodbye. She did not look back. Looking back would have meant hoping someone might follow her into the cold, and she was done with that particular hope. The road stretched ahead of her, dark and narrowing, and she walked into it with everything she owned in her 2 fists and a feeling in her chest like a door being nailed shut from the inside. By dawn, the snow had begun. The first night was in an equipment shed near the closed section of the mine, 100 yards from the shaft where her father had gone into the ground 2 years before and not come back. The shed was cold enough that her breath crystallized in the glow of the small candle she had thought to bring, and the wind found every gap between the warped planks and made itself at home in her clothing, while mice scratched in the corners with a sound like tiny industry. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the wall and thought about the folded document against her ribs, and thought about Gideon, and thought about the way her mother's jaw had set at the table. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, she stopped thinking about all of it, and simply sat with her knees drawn to her chest, and watched the candle flame bend sideways and right itself and bend again. The second night was under a wagon behind the feedlot at the south edge of town. Rats crossed her legs twice. The ground seemed to pull the warmth straight out of her marrow, a slow theft she could not stop and could not afford. She woke before dawn with her hands so stiff she could not open them all the way, and she understood for the first time in a visceral and physical way what cold actually meant. Not the cold of a drafty house or a slow morning stove. The cold of the earth itself, patient and indifferent and vast. The third night was in a root cellar that someone had forgotten to lock, black and damp, and stinking of rotted turnips, where she slept sitting upright against the wall because the floor was too wet to lie down on. When she came out at dawn, she stood in the middle of the road and realized with a clarity that frightened her more than anything else that had happened that her mind had gone very quiet. Not peaceful. Empty. She had tried asking for help before she gave up on it entirely. Eli Tate had opened his door on the second evening, a quiet widower with gentle eyes and calloused hands, raising his 9-year-old boy Wesley, alone in a house that smelled of wood smoke and boiled beans. He looked genuinely sick with sorrow when he said there was no room. She could see past him into the small kitchen where Wesley bent over a school slate doing his sums, and she knew the truth of it. 2 rooms barely space for the two of them in winter coming hard. But Eli pressed a square of cornbread into her hand before she left, still warm from the stove wrapped in a piece of cloth. The heat of it against her palm nearly broke her in a way the rejection had not. She had tried the church, locked. The Reverend was away at the territorial seat through December. His wife, Hannah Webb, a woman who wore her moral authority the way other women wore good jewelry, had let Varity sleep one night on the bench near the parsonage stove and brought her coffee at first light, and then spoken with the careful weight of a woman who had spent 20 years being the most reasonable person in any room she entered. If I shelter you beyond one night, others will ask, why not them? Every family in hardship will line up at my door. I cannot take everyone, and so I cannot take just one. She said it kindly. She meant it sincerely. It was Harlon Holt's Arithmetic wearing a kinder face, and Varity thanked her for the coffee and the single night, and walked out into the gray morning with the cornbread cloth still in her pocket. On the 4th morning, hunting fallen branches on the eastern slope of the ridge above town, she found the cave. It was not obvious. A narrow crack behind leaning stone and dead brush halfway up the slope, the kind of thing a person walked past 100 times without seeing if they were looking at the view instead of the rock. But Varity was not looking at the view. She was looking at the ground and the stone and the small signals that cold hillsides give to people who have learned to read them, and she stopped mid-stride because the air near the crack was different. Not warm, not truly, just less cold than everything around it. A faint breath of something other than the frozen world exhaling out from between the rocks, the way a held match feels against the skin before the flame actually touches that intimation of heat, before the fact of it. Her father came back to her in that moment with such completeness that she had to put her hand against the stone to steady herself. Gideon Vance had spent 12 years going underground every morning with a lantern and a pick and a faith in his own survival that never seemed to diminish, no matter how many times the mountain tested it. He had known things about rock and earth and the way enclosed spaces behaved that he could not always put in words, but he had tried. She had been 9 years old sitting on his knee in the kitchen after supper when he told her about the deep places. Underground stays the same, he had said. Summer or winter, the stone doesn't care. The deep places hold their own weather. They keep whatever they want and ignore everything above. She had not understood it then. She understood it now, standing before a crack in a hillside with frost in her hair and no home at her back, understood it the way you understand a thing when your life depends on it rather than just your curiosity. She crawled inside with the candle stub she had left in the equipment shed, cupping it against the draft. 10 feet of passage tight enough to scrape both shoulders. Then it opened. A stone chamber unexpectedly large. Dry, which was the first miracle. The ceiling arched high enough for her to stand, which was the second. Along the curve of the ceiling, faint black smudges of ancient soot marked where fires had burned not recently, not in years, but many times by someone who had known what they were doing. Near the wall to her left flat, stones formed a fire ring shaped by deliberate human hands, not a random scatter, but a considered structure, a circle of purpose. And directly above it in the ceiling, a thin fracture in the rock that disappeared upward into darkness. She held her candle near the fracture and watched the flame lean toward it, and then straighten, pulled up and away. A chimney, natural, accidental, but functioning. The kind of geological coincidence that had kept someone alive once before. She moved the candle along the walls, and there they were. Vertical lines grouped in sevens, running across a section of the eastern wall, in a column that went from about the height of a man's chest to just above his head. She counted them without meaning to, the way you count anything arranged in rows, your mind doing the arithmetic before you have decided to engage with it. There were many, weeks of them, months of them, and beside the tallied lines scratched in letters careful enough to be legible, but rough enough to have been made by a person working in poor light with whatever tool came to hand. A date. November 1854. Nearly 30 years gone. Whoever had made those marks had spent a long time in this place, had gotten up every 7th day and made a mark on the wall to prove to themselves that time was still moving, that the world outside still had a calendar, that they were still a person who measured weeks and not simply a creature of cold and fire and waiting. And then at some point, they had stopped. Varity stood holding her candle and felt two things at the same time knotted together so tightly she could not find where one ended and the other began. Hope because the cave had clearly held a human life before. And underneath the hope, a thread of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, because whoever had made those marks had stopped making them. And she did not know whether they had walked out of this place on their own 2 feet or been carried. She moved deeper into the cave following the wall with her candle hand, and that was when she found the second thing. Farther back in a section of wall where the stone was smoother, someone had worked at it with a blade over what must have been several hours. Not just scratches, a diagram. It was crude but unmistakable. A top-down view of the fire pit with lines radiating outward from it, like the spokes of a wheel, each line ending in a small rectangle. Wood arranged in a fan radiating from the center. Below that, an elevation view of the wall with markings at 2 different heights. High on the right side, near a natural ledge, a cross-hatched rectangle with marks suggesting cold. Lower on the left, near the heat of the fire, another rectangle with different marks. Food stored at the cold end. And at the top of the diagram, a simple sketch of the ceiling fracture with an arrow drawn upward through it. Someone had spent 2 seasons in this cave, learning how stone holds heat and how smoke moves and where cold air settles and where it does not. And then they had carved what they learned into the wall so that the next person who came would not have to learn it the same hard way. The next person who comes. Varity stood in the dark holding a candle stub that was burning toward her fingers, reading instructions left by a stranger 30 years ago, for a stranger 30 years hence, and she understood something that had no language attached to it, only weight. She was not the first person the world had tried to discard in a Wyoming winter. And the person who had come before her had survived. Had survived and then had thought about who might come after and had left something behind. She sat on the cold floor for the better part of an hour, not planning, just sitting in the silence, which was a different kind of silence than any she had experienced before. No wind finding its way through gaps, no exposed corner bleeding heat away, just still dry air in the mineral smell of deep rock, and somewhere far above the inaudible breathing of a mountain that did not know she existed and did not care, and was because of that indifference utterly reliable. She could survive in this place. The thought arrived not as comfort, but as instruction, and beneath it something harder. Something she did not examine too closely yet, because examining it would have meant understanding the full weight of what was ahead. Surviving in a cave above a town that had cast her out meant becoming something other than a girl waiting to be taken back in. It meant carrying her own existence on her own back. She crawled back out into the daylight and stood on the slope and looked at the valley below and made a list in her head. Potatoes first, canned goods if she could afford them, then blankets, then firewood, then kindling, then the smaller things that people forget about until they need them. A pot matches something to carry water in. She had the knife. She had $3.40 in coins. She had the diagram on the cave wall and 30 years worth of someone else's learning and a father's voice in her memory telling her that the deep places keep their own weather. She went down the hill and started carrying things up. The first week nearly broke her in a different way than the cold had. Not in her mind, but in her body, which registered every trip up the slope with an honesty that could not be argued with or ignored. Her shoulders bruised purple by the 3rd day from the rope and the weight. A blister formed on her right heel burst, reformed and burst again, until the skin simply gave up being skin and became something tougher and less sensitive, like the sole of a boot from the inside out. She followed the diagram on the wall with the seriousness of a student who understands that her grade will be whether she lives or dies. Firewood and a fan around the pit, not stacked beside it. The stone absorbed the heat from the perimeter and gave it back slowly through the night, the way a cast iron pan holds warmth after you pull it from the fire. Small fires, consistent fires, not the large roaring fires that feel like luxury and cost 3 times the wood for half the sustained warmth. Food on the cold ledge at the back of the cave, where the air ran deepest and coldest, where nothing would turn or mold. Blankets raised on a platform of branches off the stone floor, because stone against a sleeping body draws warmth out faster than the coldest air above it. She made her first real mistake in the 2nd week, and it cost her 7 days of protein. She had hung a side of salt pork near the entrance to the cave, where the light was better and the air moved, and she had been proud of the hook she carved into the rock, and less careful than she should have been about what the moving air near the entrance meant for the meat's temperature. 3 days later, she found it spoiled, gone gray at the edges, and soft where it should have been firm, and something small had found it in the night, and worked along one side in ways she preferred not to look at too closely. She stood holding the ruined meat in the lantern light and felt the shame of it burn hotter than the cold, because it was the kind of mistake that Harlon Holt would have predicted, and hearing his voice in her head telling her that careless people did not survive made her angrier than anything he had said to her face. She buried the pork outside so the smell would not draw more visitors, scrubbed the hook with snow, and then she rebuilt her system from the floor up because the cave had done her the favor of teaching her the lesson without killing her. And that was as much grace as she was going to get. After the pork, she learned faster. She notched shelves from scavenged planks using the folding knife with a care that her father would have recognized and approved of. She rationed the matches with the seriousness of someone who understands that fire is not a given, but a practice, something that requires maintenance and respect, and cannot be taken for granted any more than food or water. By the third week, the cave had stopped being a hiding place and had started being something else. She did not have a word for what it was yet. But when she came through the passage at the end of a day's gathering and saw the ordered shelves and the laid-in firewood and the blankets raised properly off the stone, something settled in her chest that was not happiness and was not pride, but was related to both. A thing earned rather than given. The town noticed. Small towns always do. Boone Carver spotted her on a Tuesday dragging a makeshift sled loaded with grain sacks toward the eastern slope. He was 31 years old and built like the trade he practiced, wide through the shoulders, carrying his certainty the way a good blacksmith carries his tools, ready for any job, and confident in the using. His voice carried across open ground whether he intended it to or not. Going to live in the woods, are you? She kept pulling and did not slow down. If she had to, she told him. He stared after her for a while and then shook his head and muttered something about the girl having gone half wild. And she heard it, and she noted it, and she let it go because she had stopped caring what Boone Carver thought of her. Around the same hour, she realized that not one person in Hollis Gap had offered her a roof. Ezra Cobb noticed this change in her purchasing before anyone else because money was the only language Ezra Cobb truly read. He was 46 years old and owned the single general store within 30 miles and sat on the three-man town council, which in practice meant that Ezra and two men who agreed with whatever Ezra decided constituted the governing authority of Hollis Gap. He was lean in the face with pale eyes that priced everything they touched, people included. He kept his ledger in a drawer he unlocked only when alone, and he wore pressed shirts even in autumn as though respectability were a thing that could be damaged by a wrinkle. He caught Varity outside the store on the morning she came for flour, leaning against the door frame, with the ease of a man who has never had to worry about whether the door would open for him. "You have been buying more than your share," he said. She met him level. She told him other families bought what they needed, that she was paying full price, that she had not taken anything that was not fairly purchased. He lowered his voice to the register men use for threats they want to sound like favors. "I have the right to refuse a sale," he told her, "if I judge a person to be hoarding against the good of the valley. The council stands behind me on it." She understood exactly what this was. Ezra Cobb did not care about the common welfare of Hollis Gap. Ezra Cobb cared about being necessary. A girl who could provision herself without his store was a girl who existed outside his arithmetic, and people outside his count made him nervous in a way he could not afford to examine directly. She bought her flour that day and walked away with it, and knew that the supply line would close at his whim, and began planning as though it already had. The hand that caught her sleeve at the corner belonged to June Cobb, 19 years old and carrying her father's sharp features over none of his sharpness. She pressed a cloth bundle into Verity's hands and breathed the words fast and low. "Salt pork," she said. "Take it. He counts the flour to the ounce, but he never counts the pork." She hesitated, then added the harder thing, the thing that cost her to say in the open air of a town where her father had ears in half the walls. "He doesn't hate you. He's afraid of you. If you live through this winter on your own, people will start to wonder whether they need him as much as he has spent his whole life convincing them they do." It was a clear-eyed thing to say, and it cost her something to say it. And Varity took the pork and held June's hand for a moment before letting go, and June squeezed back with a grip that said everything neither of them could put into words in that particular street, in that particular town. Mave Tully was 68 years old and thin as a fence rail, and had the eyes of a woman who had been reading weather for half a century and had stopped being surprised by it. She stopped Varity one evening near the east edge of town and asked plainly whether the girl had found shelter. Varity hesitated, then gave a single nod. Mave studied her the way a person studies a horizon they need to understand. Underground, the old woman said. Not a question. Varity wanted to know how she knew. Mave's answer was simple. Because underground is smarter than freezing. She pressed 2 jars of peach preserves into Verity's hands without explanation. Then before she turned away, she said something that would travel with Varity through every cold night to come. The winter of '56, I was 10 years old, she said, trapped on the Nebraska plains in a blizzard that lasted 3 weeks. My father died on the 12th day. My mother kept the rest of us breathing by burning the furniture. Chairs first, then the table, then the window frames. Her eyes held 60 years of hard weather without flinching. I am not afraid of winter, she said. I am afraid of people who refuse to prepare for it. By the end of the 3rd week, Ezra Cobb made his refusal official. He told her across the empty counter that the council had made its decision that resources were limited and priority went to established families and that he would no longer be able to serve her. She left without argument because there was none to make. The council was Ezra and his echoes. But the sound of the door closing at her back felt less like rejection than like a bolt sliding home, and she climbed back up the hill that afternoon and looked at what she had stored and thought about Gideon and what he would have done. She set snares along the ridgeline. She dug for roots where the thin early snow had not yet covered everything. Cattail and wild turnip and the things her father had shown her on idle afternoons when the mind sat quiet and he had taught her the name of every plant worth eating. Dig the cattail out of the mud, he had told her, crouching in the creek bottom with his hands dark with soil, showing her the white flesh inside the root. Wash it, roast it on the coals. It won't taste like much, but it keeps you standing. His voice came back to her with perfect clarity each time she knelt in the frozen earth. Some mornings it felt as though he had been dead 2 years. Other mornings it felt like 200. Eli Tate left a small sack of dried corn at the trail marker on a Thursday morning, no note attached. It was there when Varity came down for water, and she said nothing about it to anyone because some debts can only be repaid by remembering them. And then came the evening when she stood at the back of the cave studying the diagram on the wall by lantern light, tracing the lines with one finger, and the wind shifted outside and she lifted her head and listened. There was something different in the sound. Not louder, not more violent, just different in the way a river sounds different in the hours before a flood, a change in pitch that a body feels in the teeth before the ears can fully register it. She went to the entrance and crawled out onto the ledge and looked north. The sky had been gray for days, which was ordinary for November in Wyoming. But tonight the gray in the north had thickened to something that was almost black, a color she had no name for, the color of old iron of a door that has been closed so long the hinges have rusted solid. And the wind had shifted. She had been watching the wind since her father first pointed out the way it moved through the valley, the way the geese read it and adjusted their flight, the way the smoke from the mine shaft leaned one direction in ordinary weather and another when something was building to the north. He had shown her this because he had understood in the way that men who work underground come to understand the behavior of air, that what the wind does today tells you something about what the ground will ask of you tomorrow. The wind had shifted, and it had shifted wrong. She went back inside. She looked at the stack of firewood against the wall. Then she went back out into the dark and gathered everything within reach of the ledge and brought it in and stacked it against the wall beside what was already there. She worked until her arms gave out, and then she sat beside the small fire and looked at what she had built. A machine for staying alive. That was what the cave had become. Not comfortable, not warm in any true sense of the word. But a machine, something built with intention and maintained with care and stocked with the specific supplies that the season would demand. She thought about the people in the valley below, about the 200 souls in their timber houses with their cast iron stoves and their months of wood stacked against the usual winter, the winter they had seen before and survived before and expected again. About the men in the diner who predicted snowfall over breakfast and went home and did nothing differently. In the morning she went down the hill to tell them. The diner smelled of coffee and fried salt pork and the particular comfort of a room full of people who have not yet been frightened. She stood in the center of it in her frost-dusted coat with her hands still showing the cracks and the rope marks from 3 weeks of hauling supplies up a mountain, and she said it plainly enough for every person in the room to hear. A bad storm is coming, not an ordinary one. Build up your wood and your food today before the roads turn against you. Ezra Cobb, near the window with his coffee, smiled the smile of a man watching an amusement that has wandered into his house uninvited. Boone Carver said that if the storm was so dire, they had timber houses and cast iron stoves. So what did she have? A crack in a hillside. A few men laughed, not mean laughter, comfortable laughter. The laughter of people who have not yet been asked to be afraid and are not in any hurry to start. Hannah Webb in her measured voice said that the men in this room had survived more Wyoming winters than Varity had years on Earth. Eli Tate sat at the back with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on the table and said nothing. That silence would sit with him for a long time afterward. He knew it even as it was happening. Varity looked around the room one last time, face by face. Not from spite, but because she wanted to remember them, wanted to hold in her mind the particular look of certainty before the world sets about proving it wrong. Then she walked out and no one followed, and no one called after her, and she went back up the hill through the first thin flurries of what she did not yet know would become the worst storm the valley had ever known. She climbed through the passage and sat beside her fire, and fed a split log to the coals, and watched the sparks rise toward the chimney crack, and thought about her father, about what Gideon Vance would do when the storm arrived. He would open whatever door he had. She had always known this about him. It was the thing that had put him in the ground. She was not yet sure whether she was made of the same thing. She was not sure she wanted to be. The fire held its small, steady heat against the stone exactly as the diagram had promised. Outside, the wind began to change its voice, dropping into a register that was less like weather and more like something that had made a decision. And somewhere below her in the valley, she had been cast out of 200 people were going to sleep inside houses built for an ordinary season that was no longer coming. The blizzard arrived on a Tuesday night, and it did not come gently. Varity was feeding the fire when she felt it coming. Not the wind itself, but the thing that ran ahead of the wind, a change in pressure so complete that it popped in her ears, like descending from a great height, and the lantern flame bent sideways without any draft she could name, and then straightened, and then bent again. She set down the split log she was holding and sat very still and listened. Then the sound struck. Not a gust. Not the building howl of a storm finding its stride. A wall of sound arriving all at once, a roar so deep and so sustained that it seemed to rise out of the mountain rather than fall from the sky. The cave absorbed it the way deep water absorbs a dropped stone completely without effort. The violence reduced to a vibration she felt in the soles of her feet and the base of her spine rather than heard with her ears. The flame steadied. The walls did not tremble. The fire burned exactly as it had burned a moment before, small and deliberate and sufficient, casting its steady light across the ordered shelves and the stacked firewood and the blankets raised properly off the stone. Outside, the world she had known broke apart. She could hear it even through the mountain, timber flexing under lateral load, the high-pitched shriek of wind finding gaps in structures built for ordinary winters. And beneath all of it, a percussion that she eventually understood was snow being driven against rock faces with enough force to sound like impact rather than precipitation. She did not sleep that first night. She sat with her spine against the cold stone, watching the choked entrance, and tending the coals with the patience of someone who has learned that fire is a relationship that requires continuous attention, and she turned over the question she had been carrying for weeks. Whether to open this door. The people who had laughed at her in the diner. The people who had watched Harlon Holt cross her name off a sheet of paper and found reasons not to object. The people who had decided each in their own way and for their own reasons that the arithmetic of their comfort was more important than the arithmetic of her survival. She owed them nothing. She had done the mathematics on this herself in the sleepless dark of the equipment shed, in the root cellar, and the first frozen nights in the cave. She had added up the debts and the obligations and the moral accounting of who had given what to whom, and the column came out the same way every time. She owed them nothing. And yet, near dawn of the second day, a shape appeared at the cave entrance. Snow-heavy, moving slowly, too large for a deer, and too deliberate for anything else that would be moving through a blizzard of this magnitude, for any reason other than that staying still meant dying. Varity took up her knife and pressed herself flat against the wall beside the passage and waited. The shape crawled through on hands and knees, shedding clumps of white with every movement, and then rose into the firelight. Asa Wren was somewhere near 60 years old, though the years sat on him the way years sit on men who have spent most of them outdoors, which is to say that 60 was a minimum estimate, and the truth could have been higher without surprising anyone. He was thin and deeply weathered with a gray beard untrimmed for months in a coat of worn deerskin patched at the elbows with mismatched leather. Ice crusted his beard and his eyebrows and the front of his coat where his breath had frozen against the fabric. He looked at Varity across the firelit space with eyes that were neither afraid nor entirely calm, but lodged somewhere between the two in the particular territory that belongs to men who have seen exactly what is coming for them and have decided to walk toward it anyway. She kept the knife where it was. He looked at her hand and then at her face and then at the cave around him, and something shifted in his expression when his eyes found the eastern wall. He moved toward the fire with the slow, careful movements of a man whose body has been pushed past its tolerance and is running now on something other than warmth or strength. He lowered himself near the coals and held his hands to the heat and said nothing for a long while. Then he told her about the valley. He had come through the lower bottoms on his way up the slope. His voice was rough from long disuse, the voice of a man who had gone months at a stretch speaking to no one and had lost the habit of shaping words for other ears. The church roof had torn open along the north pitch. The feedlot's eastern wall had come down, and Eli Tate's chimney was packed solid with driven snow, which meant no fire, which meant a man alone with his 9-year-old boy in a house with no heat source in the second night of a blizzard that was not behaving like any blizzard that region had seen in living memory. If this holds past 3 days, he said, people start dying. Varity set the knife down on the shelf above her. She asked him if he had come to tell her she should go save them. He looked at her across the fire. He said he had come because his cabin had lost half its roof an hour back, and it was considerably warmer in a cave than in a structure now open to the sky. He paused. Then he said that since she asked it, yes, she ought to think on the question. They laughed at me, she said. Every one of them. I know it, he answered. Ezra cut my supply. Hannah called me a child. Boone said I had gone wild. My own mother sat at that table and watched me walk out the door. I know that too, he said. Then you know I owe them nothing. You don't, he agreed. Then tell me why I should open this door. He was quiet for a while. The fire snapped between them and the storm pushed against the mountain from outside, and the mountain ignored it with the comprehensive indifference of stone. When Asa spoke again, his voice had changed, dropped lower, the words coming up slowly, like things that have been stored in a deep place for a long time, and have to be carried a considerable distance before they can be spoken. He said that 30 years ago he had sat exactly where she was sitting now. Same stone, same kind of storm, though it had never reached the teeth of this one. He had food enough for himself and wood enough, and he had known there were people in the valley below who were cold and frightened and hungry, and he had chosen not to open the door. He had stayed and waited the storm out. It passed. Nobody died because that particular storm had not been cruel enough to kill. But he had not known that while it raged. For 8 days he had sat in this cave, not knowing whether a man was freezing to death a mile below him while he ate warm soup under dry wool. And when the storm finally quit and he came down the slope, he had walked through the valley with the question running underneath everything he saw, every face he passed, every house he entered. What if it had been worse? What if someone had died? What if one small thing from his hand could have turned it? He had carried that not knowing for 30 years. Every winter it came back and asked him again. Then she asked him what he would tell himself now if he could go back to that cave and speak to the man he had been. He looked at her across the coals for a long moment before he answered. When he did, the words came without weight or drama, the way a truth sounds when a person has stopped arguing with it. That outliving everyone alone, he said, is only a slower way of disappearing. The silence after that was long enough for the fire to burn down to coal before either of them broke it. Then Varity told him the practical truth she had been circling for days. If she opened the door and the cave filled with people, her stores would not reach spring. She had planned for one, possibly two, never a dozen. He acknowledged it. She pressed further she would be trading her own survival for people who had thrown hers away. He leaned back against the stone and looked at the ceiling and said that was one way to frame it. The other way was that she would be becoming the kind of person who did not throw a life away, even with every reason in the world laid out in front of her to do it. The fire burned down. Neither of them moved to feed it. Then Varity gave him the truth she had been carrying since the night she walked out of Harlon Holt's kitchen. If I let them die out there, when I could have reached them, she said, I become Harlon. Just one more person deciding who is worth the saving. Asa Wren did not say he had told her so. He simply reached forward and set a piece of wood on the coals and waited for the flame to find it. She went out in the gray screaming light of the second morning and found Mave Tully face down in the snow 40 yards below the cave entrance. The old woman had made it most of the way up the slope before the wind took her legs. She was slight, barely more than bone and will wrapped in wool, and the blizzard had found her lightweight and made use of the fact. One side of her coat had soaked through and frozen rigid. Her gloves were white-crusted stone. Her lips had gone the wrong color, and her eyes were closed. And when Varity dropped to her knees in the snow and rolled the old woman onto her back and said her name, the eyes that opened were unfocused, drifting the eyes of a body that has made a preliminary decision to close its own doors and is waiting to see whether anyone objects. "I knew you had gone underground," Mave breathed. Her voice was barely there, a thread of sound in the screaming wind. Getting back up the slope with the old woman across her shoulders was the hardest labor Varity had ever set her body to. The drifts ran waist-deep in places, and the wind found them broadside twice, and both times it tore Mave from her grip. Both times she went back and lifted again, and kept climbing because somewhere below the muscle and below the will, there was a layer of something that did not negotiate and did not calculate and simply refused, and it was from that layer that the strength came. She found the entrance by the split boulder she had fixed in her memory as a landmark already half buried, and then the passage swallowed them, and the roar became a murmur, and the murmur became silence, and warmth reached for them both like a hand extended in a dark room. Asa was on his feet before she cleared the passage. He took Mave from her without a word, carried the old woman to the fire as though she weighed nothing, and began working the blood back into her white-tipped fingers between his palms. Varity wrapped blankets around the thin shoulders and built the fire to a blaze and brought snow in to melt for water. Mave's eyes found their focus slowly. She took in the shelves, the stacked wood, the ordered stores. Her expression moved through confusion and then recognition, and then something that was not quite awe, but was close to it. "You truly built all of this," she said. "Somebody had to," Varity answered. They were sealed inside for the rest of that day and through the night. When the third morning came and the storm showed no sign of weakening, Varity crawled to the entrance and looked out and counted the chimneys she could see from the ledge and noted which ones had smoke and which ones did not. Too many did not. Eli Tate came up the slope on the afternoon of the third day with Wesley on his back. She saw them from the ledge before they saw her two figures working through drifts that reached the man's chest in the low places. The small boy riding with his arms locked around his father's neck and his face buried against his father's collar. Eli was moving the way men move when they are operating past the point where movement should be possible on rhythm rather than strength, one foot and then the other. Not because the body is capable, but because stopping is the one option that cannot be chosen. Wesley's lips were the wrong color when Eli finally cleared the entrance and straightened in the firelight. His eyes were half shut, and his small hands, when Varity took them between her own, were cold in a way that meant the cold had been working on him for longer than anyone would have wanted. Eli stopped in the middle of the cave and stared. His gaze moved across the shelves, across the stacked firewood, across the raised sleeping platform, and the organized provisions. Then it stopped on one particular shelf where the dried corn sat in a cloth sack. He recognized the corn. She could see it in his face in the way something moved behind his eyes and then settled into a different expression than the one he had arrived with, an expression that had shame in it, and relief and exhaustion all folded together. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything about Thursdays or trail markers or sacks left without notes. "Please," he said. His voice was quiet. "Our stove died 2 days ago. The chimney is packed solid and I could not clear it." She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. She wrapped Wesley by the fire and gave him warm water first, then broth made from dried beef thinned with snowmelt. The boy shook for 20 minutes before the heat reached him. Deep, shuddering tremors that she recognized instinctively as the body arguing with itself about whether to commit to warming. Then he stopped shaking and curled against a grain sack and dropped into the sudden, complete sleep of a child whose body has finally decided it is safe. Eli sat beside his son and held the small hand and said nothing for a long time. The next arrivals came in pairs and then in small groups, and each arrival changed the mathematics of the cave in a way that Varity tracked without showing that she was tracking it. A young couple from a homestead south of town carrying nothing but each other and the clothes they had been wearing for 3 days. A woman from the east side with 2 children under 10, her husband somewhere south trying to reach his brother's property. No word of whether he had made it. An older man who had followed the fence line uphill until the fence ended, and the rock began arriving with frost-bitten hands and the careful movements of someone who has used up everything they had to get somewhere and is only now allowing themselves to stop. Each body that came through the passage was a life and also a subtraction. Varity knew this and felt both things simultaneously, the warmth of each arrival and the cold calculation beneath it, and she kept both feelings and let neither one cancel the other out because both of them were true. Hannah Webb arrived on the fourth day, wet through and shaking, and she sat where Varity directed her to sit and took the food that was handed to her and said nothing about experience or judgment or the number of winters she had outlasted. She simply sat and watched a 17-year-old girl manage a cave full of frightened adult people with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been training for this without knowing it was training. Boone Carver arrived just before dark on the fourth day with his 6-year-old niece Pearl across his arms. He came through the entrance and straightened and stopped and looked at the interior of the cave, the way a man looks at something he has fundamentally misjudged. The shelves running the length of the walls stacked with jars and sacks, and the accumulated provision of 3 weeks of labor. The dry firewood ready to hand, the warm and steady air while the blizzard still threw itself against the mountain's back with undiminished violence. "You built all of this on your own," he said. "Yes." He was quiet a moment, taking it in. Then he said he had laughed at her for hauling it up there. She confirmed that he had. He turned his hat in his hands and looked at the floor with the particular discomfort of a man discovering himself wrong about something that mattered, and then he said that he reckoned he had played the fool. She did not tell him he was wrong about that, but she held out her arms for Pearl, and he transferred the girl carefully, and Varity felt at once the heat coming off the small body that should not have been there, the fevered heat that means a child's defenses have been breached. She looked at the flushed face and felt the forehead with the back of her hand and looked up at Boone. She told him to put her by the fire. Warm water, first small sips. Mave examined Pearl with hands that moved over the small body with the practiced economy of a woman who had nursed the sick in places where no doctor came within 50 miles. She drew Varity aside, voice dropped below the hearing of the others. "Lung fever," she said, "or close enough that the distinction matters less than the treatment. She needs warmth and water and rest. If the fever does not break within 2 days," she said, and left the sentence open in the way that experienced people leave sentences open when the conclusion is one they prefer not to speak aloud. Boone heard it. He sat beside Pearl and took her hand, and his face went the color of old ash. The loud-voiced man who had called Varity half wild sat in the firelight with the small fingers inside his large ones and did not say a single word. And Varity understood that she was seeing Boone Carver for the first time, the man underneath the certainty, the man who had exactly one vulnerability and was watching it fight for its life in a cave he had dismissed as a hole in a hillside. It was in the middle of the 5th night when Pearl's breathing had roughened, and the whole cave had organized itself around the small body by the fire that Boone told Varity the things she had not known. Pearl had cried out in her sleep, a sound that brought every adult in the cave to full alertness in the space of a breath. Then the girl had subsided into a murmuring that was not quite language, and in it she called a name. Papa. Clear as struck glass in the firelit dark. Not Boone's name. Something else. Boone sat very still. Then he touched Verity's arm and drew her back toward the cold end of the cave away from the others. He told her quietly, Pearl was not his sister by blood. She was his brother Clem's daughter left behind when Clem died, and before Varity could ask where or how, he told her. The Eastern Tunnel, he said. The collapse of 1881. Clem Carver had been on the crew pushing past the surveyed safe depth. He had been 24 years old and had a pregnant wife, and had taken the deeper assignment because it paid 12 cents more per shift, and 12 cents per shift over a season was the difference between a warm house and a cold one. The Eastern Tunnel, the spring of 1881, the same collapse, the same 4 men. Varity stood in the cold end of the cave with Boone's words settling over her like snow, and thought about the folded document against her ribs and the name at the bottom of it. Harlon Holt's careful signature. The authorization to proceed below the surveyed safe depth. The 12-cent differential that had put Clem Carver and Gideon Vance in the same shaft at the same depth at the same moment when the mountain made its decision. 2 children left behind. 1 cave. Brought here by the same storm, sharing the same fire, connected by a piece of paper that a man in a pressed shirt kept in a locked drawer. Boone looked at her across the dark. He did not know about the document. She did not tell him. But something passed between them in that moment that rearranged things, some understanding that did not need language, and was larger than either of them. And from that point forward, Boone Carver stood behind every decision Verity made in the cave, without hesitation and without question. The fifth day brought Royce Trumbull and his son Cole. Royce was broad-chested and loud in the specific way of men who have never had to be anything else a farmer of 40-some years, who filled rooms with his presence and his opinions, and had spent his life in a valley small enough that neither had ever been seriously challenged. His boy Cole was 16 and watchful in the way that boys are watchful when they have spent years studying a man they are not sure they want to become. They came through on the fifth evening and Royce began within the hour. The cave was too cold. The food was inadequate. The sleeping arrangements were an indignity. He paced the length of the chamber muttering about his livestock and his farm, and the circumstances that had brought him to shelter in a hole in the ground beside people he would not ordinarily share a fence line with. When Verity divided the evening meal into equal portions and set Royce's in front of him, he stood up. He was twice the size of half the people in this cave, he said. He needed more than that. Equal portions, Verity said. No exceptions. He wanted to know who had given her the authority to set rules and what was he would remind her a hole in the ground and not her house. She built this place, Boone said. His voice was quiet and very clear. She stocked it. She is the reason any of us are still drawing breath tonight. You want to argue about portions, you can take the argument outside. From the shadow of his rear wall, Asa spoke without raising his voice or shifting his position. He said that he had seen men open each other's throats over half a loaf of bread in a bad winter. Equal shares was the only road where nobody died by another person's hand. It was not a moral argument. It was an observation about outcomes stated by a man old enough to have watched the alternative play out. The cave went still. Firelight moved on the walls. Royce looked around the chamber for one man to stand with him. No one met his eyes. Then Cole Trumbull said quietly without drama, "Stop, Dad." Royce looked at his son as though the boy had struck him. Cole did not look away. He held his father's gaze with the particular steadiness of a young person who has made a decision they are not going to unmake regardless of the cost. And the cost was written plainly on Royce's face for anyone present to read. Royce sat down. He took his portion. He did not speak again that night, but his eyes stayed hot, and he did not look at Cole, and Cole did not look at him. And between them something had shifted that the storm had not caused, but had merely provided the occasion for the way storms always provide the occasion for the things that were already waiting to happen. Later, when the others were sleeping, Cole came to where Verity was banking the fire for the night. He apologized for his father. She told him he did not have to answer for someone else's choices. He said he knew that, but someone needed to say it. Then he went back to his blanket, and she watched him for a moment, this boy close to her own age, who had just chosen honesty over blood in front of a cave full of witnesses, and she understood the cost of it because she had paid a version of it herself the night she walked out of Harlon Holt's kitchen. June Cobb arrived on the sixth night. She appeared at the entrance barely audible above the wind, a sound so soft that Verity nearly dismissed it as the storm finding a new register. She crawled through and rose into the firelight, and her teeth were chattering so hard she could not form words for several minutes. Verity brought her to the fire and wrapped her and waited. When June could speak, she opened the sack she had been clutching against her chest through the blizzard. Flour, dried corn, a handful of salt pork. Not much, but something. She had taken it from the storeroom, she said. Her father had caught her at it. He had told her that if she walked out the door, she was no daughter of his. Verity asked why she had come anyway. June's eyes filled. Because he is keeping the storeroom locked, she said. 200 pounds of flour, 100 of salt pork, 40 jars of preserves, and he is handing supply only to the families he chooses people who owe him money or favors. Everyone else gets nothing. She pulled the back of her shaking hand across her face. I could not sit in that house and watch him weigh who is allowed to eat, she said, while a child burns up in a cave because the storm came for everyone, and he only opened his door for some of them. Verity pulled her close and held her. Two girls cast out by their own people, sitting together in the only honest shelter in a valley of bolted doors. That night, Pearl's fever climbed to its summit. The child burned so fiercely that the blanket over her went damp with sweat within the hour. Her small frame shook with coughs that seemed to rise from somewhere far below the lungs, deep and tearing each one a labor. Mave stayed beside her through every hour, changing wet cloths on the burning forehead, spooning warm water sweetened with honey into the cracked mouth, murmuring in a low, continuous voice that might have been prayer or instruction, or simply the oldest human offering the sound of another person present in the dark. Asa had carried a small jar of honey down from his cabin before the roof gave way. He produced it from his coat pocket and set it beside Mave without comment and went back to his corner. Boone sat against the stone wall holding Pearl's hand. He did not speak. He did not move. Food was placed beside him and he did not eat it. The man who had carried a loud opinion on every subject sat in total silence through that long night, learning at the specific and irreversible cost of a child's fever that every word he had ever spent was worth exactly nothing against this. Varity tended the fire and watched and waited and felt the weight of the cave's population in a way that was no longer abstract. They were not mouths to be subtracted from a supply column. They were Mave's steady hands, and June's grief, and Eli's quiet watching, and Cole's new-made courage, and Wesley asleep against the grain sack, and Boone's large hands around his niece's small fingers, holding on the way Varity had held onto the rope on the slope, with 60 pounds swinging below her in the dark. Holding on because letting go was the one option that could not be chosen. Sometime past midnight, Pearl stopped coughing. The cave went very quiet. Boone's hand tightened on the small fingers. Every breathing person in the chamber held their breath. Then Pearl drew a long, clear breath deeper than any she had managed in 2 days. The tension in her small face eased. The sweat on her forehead began at last to cool. Mave caught Verity's eye across the fire and nodded once. Varity let out a breath she had not known she had been holding for 2 days. Boone made no sound. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against Pearl's hand, and his shoulders moved in the way that a person's shoulders move when they are releasing something they have been holding so tightly for so long that the letting go is almost worse than the holding. The storm pushed against the mountain. The mountain held. Varity moved to the back of the cave and held her lantern up to the wall where the tally marks ran in their long column below the diagram that Asa had left for the stranger who came after him. She picked up the piece of charcoal she had been using to mark her supply counts and wrote a number on the stone below everything else. Not a tally mark, a practical number, the count of what remained against the count of days that would feed the people sleeping around her if she cut the portions by a third. 2 days. She looked at the number for a while. Then she put the charcoal down and went back to the fire and sat beside it and watched Pearl breathe, and the breaths came steady and even and deep. And outside the wind began at last, almost imperceptibly, to drop in register. The first indication that somewhere beyond what any of them could see, the storm had made a decision about its own limits. She did not sleep. She sat with the fire in the sleeping cave and the number on the wall and thought about the morning and about what came after the morning and about what it meant to have opened a door you built with your own hands for the same people who told you that you had no right to build anything at all. The storm did not end with drama. There was no sudden clearing, no shaft of light breaking through cloud, no moment a person could point to and say there that was when it stopped. The blizzard surrendered the way exhausted things surrender by degrees, losing force across the span of a night. The way a fever breaks, not all at once but in stages, the violence dropping out of the wind hour by hour, until what remained was just weather again, ordinary and manageable and cold, in the way Wyoming was always cold in November, which was cold enough but no longer murderous. Varity was awake when the change came. She had not slept more than an hour at a stretch through the final night, feeding the fire in small, careful increments, listening to the storm work through its diminishment outside the stone. She tracked it by sound the way her father had taught her to track underground conditions by sound, the way a miner learns to hear the difference between rock settling and rock preparing to move. The roar dropped to a sustained howl. The howl dropped to a moan. The moan thinned to the sound of ordinary wind moving through ordinary cold in a valley that had been remade by 8 days of extraordinary violence. When the stillness finally arrived, it was so complete she could hear her own pulse. She crawled to the entrance and pushed through the packed snow and stood on the ledge in the gray light of early morning and looked out at a world she did not immediately recognize. The valley had been erased. Every familiar shape was gone, buried, or warped past, knowing under a depth of snow that the eye refused to accurately calculate because the mind kept trying to substitute the remembered landscape for the one actually present. Where roads had run, there were smooth white plains shaped by the wind into drifts that rose above the height of a standing man. Fence lines had drowned entirely, their posts swallowed without a trace. Rooftops surfaced from the white like the spines of something vast and sleeping beneath the surface of a frozen sea. And from a number of chimneys, no smoke climbed at all. She stood in air so cold it cut so clean it ached and counted. The smokeless chimneys were not random. They clustered toward the east side of town, where the older and smaller houses sat, where the families with the least surplus lived. She counted 7. Then she counted again because she wanted the number to be wrong. It was not wrong. Behind her, she heard the cave beginning to wake. The small sounds of bodies returning to themselves after the compressed and watchful sleep of people who have been sheltering from something large. Blankets shifting, someone coughing. Then a young voice, clear and immediate. Wesley Tate, 4 days underground and starved for sky, asked if they could go out. His father told him in a minute. But Wesley had already pressed past Varity through the entrance and into the snow, sinking to his waist in the first step and plunging 2 more steps on the momentum of pure boyhood before the depth stopped him. He stood chest deep in the white with his face turned up to the pale sky and laughed. The sound carried across the silent valley with a clarity that the storm had made possible by stripping every other sound from the world. A child's laugh ringing off buried rooftops, bright and unguarded, and entirely without calculation. The sound of a human creature deciding that the world is good on the basis of evidence as simple as cold air and open sky. Every adult standing at that entrance changed in some way at the sound of it. Boone shut his eyes. Hannah pressed a hand over her mouth. Mave stood very still and let the sound move through her like water through a cupped palm, not trying to hold it, just letting it pass. Eli watched his son, and his face did something that had nothing to do with muscles and everything to do with the 8 days he had spent carrying the boy up a frozen mountain in a blizzard. Even Royce Trumbull, who had barely spoken since the night Cole had corrected him in front of the cave, lifted his head toward the laughing child with a look that had something working in it, something not yet soft, but no longer entirely stone. Boone carried Pearl out into the light. The girl squinted against the brightness. Her color restored the fever well behind her now, though she was still slight and careful in her movements, still conserving herself the way a body does in the days after a serious illness. She murmured something against her brother's neck that no one else could hear. Boone nodded and held her tighter and said something back, and whatever passed between them in that exchange was private in the way that the most important things always are. Asa Wren stood apart at the rear of the group, his eyes on the valley below his face, giving nothing away. Varity looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them spoke, because everything that needed saying between them had already been said in the dark, over a fire that was now banked to coals in a cave that had held them both through the worst 8 days the valley had ever seen. Cole Trumbull stood beside Varity without being asked. When his father pushed past them both and started down the slope toward town, Cole did not follow. He stayed where he was beside the girl his father had tried to bully over a plate of food and watched the broad back descend through the drifts. It was a small thing staying, but small things are sometimes the loudest declarations a person can make, and Varity understood it for what it was without needing it explained. The walk down took the better part of an hour. The snow ran chest deep in the drifts and knee deep in the shallower stretches, and they moved in single file. Varity and Boone breaking trail at the front, the rest following in the channel. They cut through the white. Asa brought up the rear, silent and watchful, the way a man walks who has learned to be responsible for the ground behind him as well as the ground ahead. Mave moved slowly but did not complain, one hand on Eli's arm for balance, her eyes on the valley below, with the expression of a woman assessing damage she has spent 60 years preparing herself to assess. Wesley walked on his own, stomping each step with the fierce and deliberate energy of a 9-year-old boy who has been underground for 4 days and intends to reclaim every minute of it. They reached the main road, or where it had been by mid-morning. Hollis Gap looked like a place that had been struck by something and then buried where it fell. Windows smashed inward on 3 houses on the north side. The feedlot's roof had caved under the accumulated weight, its timbers splayed outward in a shape that was almost peaceful in the morning stillness. A wagon had been carried from the livery and set against the side of the blacksmith shop by the wind alone, without apparent violence, as though it had simply walked there during the night and decided to rest. People were already out in the streets, moving with the slow and slightly dazed efficiency of survivors who have not yet fully grasped the size of what they have outlived. Neighbors digging paths between houses. A man working at a choked chimney with a long pole. 2 women redistributing blankets from a household that had more to a household that had less, the exchange conducted in near silence, in the economical way of people for whom the usual social ceremonies have been temporarily suspended by more urgent mathematics. The Wheeler family on the south end had been trapped inside their house for 6 days, unable to force the door against the packed snow, and 3 men were digging them free when Verity's group arrived in the street. The door finally gave, and Mrs. Wheeler came out into the light holding her youngest child against her chest with both arms and would not set him down. She stood in the churned snow while her other children moved around her, and her face was doing several things at once that did not have individual names. She had burned her kitchen chairs on the third night, she said, when someone asked how they had managed. Then the table on the fourth. Then the window frames on the fifth. She said it the way a person recites facts they have not yet converted into feelings, the feelings being too large and too recent to approach directly. It was the general store that drew every eye as the gathering grew. Ezra Cobb's building stood nearly whole in the center of a street of wounded structures. Its walls reinforced with extra timber, its roof holding its windows shuttered behind heavy wooden covers that had been fitted with a precision that spoke of preparation rather than improvisation. While every other structure in Hollis Gap had taken some wound from the storm, the store looked as though it had been built specifically for this event. Because it had been. Because the man inside had known. Boone Carver walked toward the barred door with a look that Verity had not seen on him before. Not the loud and easy certainty she was accustomed to seeing on his face. Something quieter and more deliberate, the expression of a man who has spent 8 days holding his niece's hand through a lung fever, while a man a mile away sat behind reinforced walls with 100 pounds of salt pork and made his choices. He stopped in the trampled snow before the door and called out, "Ezra, open up!" Nothing moved inside. The street was filling now. People drawn by the gathering, the way people are always drawn by gatherings in small towns, the social instinct surviving even the worst storms. Within 10 minutes, nearly half of Hollis Gap stood in the churned white before the store, their breath rising in small clouds, their faces carrying the particular combination of exhaustion and unresolved anger that belongs to people who have just survived something they should not have had to survive alone. Boone called again louder. The bar lifted. The door swung inward. Ezra Cobb stood in the gap, looking thinner than Verity remembered, his face drawn, his pale eyes moving across the assembled crowd with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing this moment in his mind for 8 days and has found that the rehearsal did not adequately prepare him for the reality of it. His hands at his sides were not entirely steady. "You locked this store," Boone said. His voice carried in the still air without effort. "You sat in here with 200 pounds of flour and 100 of salt pork, and God knows what else, while Pearl nearly died of lung fever in a cave on the hill." "I protected my inventory," Ezra said. His voice was steady. He had prepared this answer. "I have a right to protect what is mine." "A right," Boone said. He turned the word over the way you turn something over when you are examining it for the rot inside. "Pearl is 6 years old, Ezra. I offered supply to families who came to me," Ezra said. "Several received provisions, the families you chose." The voice came from the back of the crowd, quiet and caring. Eli Tate moved through the gathered people until he stood in the open ground between the crowd and the door, his boy Wesley beside him, and Verity realized she was watching Eli Tate angry for the first time in all the years she had known him. It transformed him. The gentle widower with the kind eyes and the soft voice became something forged, something that had been put in a fire and come out harder than it went in. And when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that owed nothing to volume and everything to what stood behind it. "You handed food out by who owed you," Eli said. "The Wheelers, the Dunn's people, already in debt to this store. Everyone else got nothing. My son included." Ezra's mouth opened. Eli pressed on the iron in him, quiet and complete. "My son's lips were blue when I carried him up that hill. 9 years old, turning blue, and I had nothing to give him. Nothing. Because you threw the bolt." The crowd shifted. Verity watched faces change, people who had lived alongside Ezra Cobb for years, bought from him, accepted his seat on the council, tolerated the small ways in which his control of the supply made itself felt in the daily life of the valley. They looked at him now with something that was past anger. Recognition. The recognition of a thing half known for a long time and never directly examined. Then June stepped forward. She had been standing near Verity, and she stepped into the open ground beside Eli and held up a folded piece of paper. Her hand was steady. She said she had found it in her father's desk drawer the night the storm arrived, when she was alone in the store. She read the date at the top of the document aloud. 2 weeks before the blizzard. She read the letterhead. Territorial Weather Service, Cheyenne Office. She read the summary in a clear voice that did not shake. Severe blizzard warning. Predicted duration 8 to 12 days. Recommended immediate preparation of all residential structures and community supply reserves. She folded the paper and looked at her father. Ezra looked back at her. He did not reach for the document. He did not dispute it. He said nothing, which was in its way the most complete answer he could have given. Varity stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. In the silence of that crowd, she had no need. "You refused to sell to me 3 months ago," she said. "You told me I was hoarding against the good of the valley. Then you locked your store through the worst storm in the history of this valley and fed only the people who served your interest." She let it sit for a moment in the cold air. "So which of us was the one harming this valley, Ezra?" The hush that followed had no bottom to it. Ezra looked at her, then at the crowd, then back at her. His mouth moved without producing sound. Behind him, visible through the open door, the shelves of the store ran in orderly rows stocked with the provision that could have carried half the town through the storm, and had instead sat here in the dark, counted and cataloged and withheld. Eli spoke again. He called for a vote of the council to strip Ezra Cobb of his charge over winter supply and to open the store to every family in the valley, equal portions, no exceptions. He asked for a show of hands. Hannah Webb's hand went up first, then Boone's without hesitation. Then one by one the hands rose across the crowd, the Wheelers still in their snow-crusted coats, the neighbors who had dug them free, the families who had received nothing, and the families who had received only what their debt to Ezra purchased. Then at the back of the crowd, Royce Trumbull raised his hand. He raised it without looking at anyone except his son, and Cole, standing beside Varity, raised his at the same moment. Father and son arms lifted for the same cause, looking at each other across 20 feet of churned snow. Between them, something passed that was not forgiveness and was not reconciliation, but was perhaps the first material from which those things might eventually be built, given enough time and enough willingness to try. Ezra counted the hands with his reckoning eyes, the same eyes that had spent a lifetime pricing everything they touched. He understood what he was looking at, not just a vote, the end of something that he had spent decades constructing, the careful arrangement by which 200 people needed him more than they needed each other. His gaze moved one last time across the crowd and found June. She looked back at him with grief and resolve held in a balance that was clearly costing her to maintain. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped backward into the store and drew the door shut. Not with anger, not with a slam, but with a quiet and definitive click. The sound of a man retreating to the last ground still his. Boone and Eli opened the door. It was no longer barred. Varity organized the distribution the way she had organized the cave, with the same attention to quantity and fairness, and the same refusal to let sentiment override logistics. Every family received the same measure. No household took more than its neighbor. The skill of keeping 12 people alive underground translated without friction to the larger task of keeping a town alive above it, because the principle was the same in both places. Those who had more gave toward those who had less until the line between them disappeared. June stood beside her through the entire distribution, working her father's store with hands that knew every shelf and every sack and every jar, doing the work she had always known how to do in a building she had grown up in, but doing it now as someone she had chosen to become rather than someone she had been born into. On the following morning, Varity walked down the hill toward the house she had been cast out of. The path to the door had been cleared, but poorly, a narrow trench dug by someone without much strength left for the effort. She stood at the door for a full minute before she knocked, listening to water dripping from the eaves where the thin winter sun had found a little purchase on the overhang, listening to her own breathing, trying to identify what she had come here for. Not confrontation. She had examined that possibility on the way down the slope and set it aside. The satisfaction of confrontation required an audience, and what she needed was something private, something true. Harlon Holt opened the door slowly. He looked older than the man in her memory. The months since she had last seen him had worked on him in ways that ordinary time does not usually work. The specific aging that happens to people when the certainties they have built their lives on are exposed to conditions they were not designed to withstand. He had lost weight. His shirt hung loose at the shoulders. His eyes moved past her to the supply sled that Boone had helped her load that morning and was now parked at the edge of the cleared path. "You came back," he said. Varity looked past him into the kitchen. The table stood where it always had. She could see the surface, the grain of the wood, the particular rectangle of it that she would never be able to look at without seeing the sheet of paper that had been laid there, the columns of figures, the single struck-through line. "No," she said. "I came to see whether my mother needs supplies." Harlon did not step aside immediately. She watched him work through it, the man who lived by figures trying to calculate what he was looking at. A girl he had subtracted from his household had returned in winter with more provision than he had managed to store, accompanied by the largest man in town. And she was not angry, and she was not triumphant, and she was not asking for anything except to see her mother. "I did not think," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "I did not believe you would." He did not finish the sentence. She understood what the missing words were. He had not believed she would survive. He had done his arithmetic and reached his conclusion, and the conclusion had been wrong. And Harlon Holt was a man who had built his entire sense of himself on the reliability of his arithmetic, and that was a more significant reckoning than any she could have delivered by anger or accusation. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words, not an apology. Harlon Holt was not built for apology in the way that certain men are not built for it, not from cruelty, but from a structural inability to locate themselves in the wrong, without feeling that the entire foundation shifts beneath them. But it was an admission, and for a man who lived by certainty, conceding that his figures had failed was perhaps the hardest sentence he had ever spoken. Varity took it for what it was. She had learned across this winter that people offer what they are capable of offering, and demanding more than a person's capacity was a recipe for a bitterness she was finished carrying. Then Dorothy appeared behind her husband. She looked smaller than memory held her and thinner, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there before and would probably not fully leave. But she was standing straight. She was looking at her daughter directly, not at the floor, not at her hands, not at some middle distance where difficult things could be avoided. "The night you left," Dorothy said, "I stood at the window and watched you walk down the road until I could not see you anymore." Her voice was steady in the way of a person who has rehearsed a thing many times in private and has decided that when the moment comes, they will not flinch from it. "Then I went back to that table," Dorothy said, "and I burned his paper." Harlon turned to look at his wife. He had not known this. Varity could see it in him, the information arriving and rearranging things. Dorothy held her husband's gaze without dropping it. "I burned it because I could not sit at that table every morning and look at my daughter's name crossed out in our own kitchen. That was the only answer I had the strength left to give." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Outside, Boone's horse shifted its weight in the snow. Varity looked at her mother and understood something she had not been able to see from inside the pain of the original night. Dorothy had not been empty at that table. She had been broken, which was a different condition entirely, because broken things still hold their shape, still retain the form of what they were, even when the structure is compromised. Her mother's silence had not been consent. It had been the sound of a woman who had spent every reserve she had and could not force one more syllable past the exhaustion and the fear and the grief of 3 brutal winters. But she had burned the paper. Alone in a cold kitchen with her daughter already gone into the dark, she had committed the only act of resistance available to her. The quietest of refusals, and one that no one had seen, and one that she had carried since then, in the particular private way that people carry the things they did when no one was watching. Varity took her mother's hand. Dorothy gripped back with a force that startled them both. "I know," Varity said. 2 words. Not forgiveness, not yet the distance between them, too recently crossed, and the bridge too newly built to carry full weight. But the beginning of something. A span thrown across the gap, narrow and fragile, and built from both sides, because that is the only way a bridge between 2 people can be built. Then Varity reached into her coat. She had been carrying the document for 3 months against her ribs, the proof of what Harlon Holt had signed his name to the authorization that had put Gideon Vance and Clem Carver into the eastern tunnel at a depth that the mountain had not agreed to. She had carried it as a kind of ballast, a weight that kept her oriented, a proof of the things she knew that no one else in Hollis Gap knew she knew. She laid it on the table. Not beside the supplies, not at the edge. She laid it in the center of the table in the exact rectangle of wood where his sheet of figures had rested 3 months before, where her name had been struck through with a single clean line, and she smoothed it flat with one hand so that the letterhead was legible, and the columns of text were legible, and the signature at the bottom was legible in the kitchen light. Harlon looked at it. He did not reach for it. He did not speak. He stood very still in the way that a man stands when he recognizes something he has been waiting to face and has not fully prepared for. despite the waiting and whatever color had remained in his face after the winter left it now. She gave him enough time to read it. She knew he did not need long. It was his own handwriting at the bottom of the page. A man recognizes his own signature even across 2 years, in a winter that has changed everything around it. Then she picked up the document, crossed to the stove, and opened the firebox. She fed it in and watched the paper curl and blacken and dissolve. The careful dark ink gone in seconds, the letterhead gone, the columns of authorization gone, the legal architecture of a decision that had put Gideon Vance and Clem Carver into the Eastern Tunnel, reduced to ash in a kitchen stove on a winter afternoon. Not forgiveness. She was clear with herself about that. Harlon Holt had not earned forgiveness, and the 3 words he had spoken in the doorway were not currency enough to purchase it. But she was choosing not to be the keeper of this document. She was choosing not to carry the proof of his guilt as the weight around which her own life organized itself, because Gideon Vance had not died, so his daughter could spend her years as a monument to his death. She closed the firebox. The kitchen was very quiet. Harlon said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say, and he seemed to understand this, which was perhaps the most self-aware moment she had ever witnessed from him. Dorothy stood beside her husband, with her hand on his arm, not comforting him, simply present the way a person stands beside something they cannot fix but will not abandon. Varity picked up her coat. "I know what you signed," she said. "I have known since the night I left. I am not carrying it anymore. That is not the same as telling you it did not happen." She walked out without waiting for a response. At the edge of the porch she turned. Dorothy stood in the doorway, back straight, chin lifted. Harlon stood behind her in the kitchen looking at the stove. Varity walked back up the hill toward the cave, and for the first time in 3 months, the inside pocket of her coat held nothing but the leather pouch with the lock of her father's hair. Asa was gone the next morning. His corner was empty. The blanket he had used was folded in a square so precise it seemed to have been measured the corners exact. His deerskin coat was gone. The short-handled hatchet he had given Varity weeks before sat on the shelf beside the fire pit, and next to it a torn scrap of paper with 5 words written in a hand unaccustomed to holding a pencil. "Cave is yours now. Paid." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in her coat beside the leather pouch with her father's hair. 2 men who had shaped her, one by dying and one by choosing to let go, carried now in the same pocket. She brought the note to Mave that afternoon. The old woman read it, folded it back along the same lines, returned it without comment. Then she was quiet for a while, looking out the cave entrance at the valley below, where the first recovery work was already visible. Men moving between houses, smoke rising properly from cleared chimneys. "He did not leave because he stopped caring," Mave said finally. "He left because he is finished. 30 years he carried that question, whether he should have opened his door. You answered it for him, not with words." "By opening mine," Varity said. Mave nodded. "Will I see him again?" Varity asked. Mave's smile was small and certain. "You will find his footprints in the snow every winter," she said. "That is how he will say good morning." It was enough. Some people speak through presence and others only through absence, and the distinction between the two, Varity understood now, was the same as the difference between a door left open and a door thrown shut at someone's back. Asa had walked through an open door. Harlon Holt had thrown the bolt. The difference between leaving and abandoning was not about the going. It was about what you left behind you when you went. In the weeks that followed, Hollis Gap set about the work of becoming something different from what it had been. Root cellars were dug deeper before the spring thaw could close the window for it. 3 new storm shelters were carved into the ridge above town, marked with painted stones so anyone in the valley could find them in poor visibility. Families began laying in preserves in September, now not waiting for the first hard frost to remind them that winter was coming. The Reverend returned from Cheyenne 2 days after the storm ended and spent his first night back on his knees in the damaged church before he stood up and began personally overseeing the construction of a community supply reserve in the church basement, open to any family, regardless of standing or means. Hannah stood beside him, driving nails, saying nothing about the bench by the parsonage stove, the single night she had offered, and the morning she had delivered the careful explanation of why one night was all she could give. She did not need to say anything. She was driving nails. Ezra Cobb did not apologize to the town. He was not the kind of man who could, and no one expected it of him. But the store reopened in March at the old prices, no restrictions, no favorites, Every family served in the order they arrived and sent home with what they needed. And beginning in the first week of March, a sack of flour appeared outside the cave entrance every Thursday morning, no note attached, no name. June knew whose hands had carried it up the slope. She said nothing about it to her father. There are exchanges better conducted through sacks of flour than through any words a mouth can shape, and both of them understood this without discussing it. June did not return to her father's house until February, when Mave mentioned in passing that Ezra had been coughing badly for 2 weeks and had not been seen at the counter. June went that evening. She knocked at the back door. Ezra opened it after a long delay, his face gray with sickness, and with something else beneath it, the particular coloring of a man who has been left alone with his choices long enough to see them from every angle. June walked past him without waiting for an invitation. She put water on the stove. She swept the floor. She made broth from salt pork and fed it to him without conversation. And when he finally asked her in a voice rough and diminished by illness, and by something older than illness, why she had come back, she gave him the same 4 words Varity had spoken on the slope in the blizzard. Because somebody had to. She offered nothing more. He asked for nothing more. Ezra looked at his daughter for a long moment. The words were not hers, he understood that. She had not arrived at them through family obligation or filial duty. She had arrived at them through someone else, through a choice made in a blizzard by a girl he had cut off from his store and his counsel and his valley's supply of everything necessary to survive. His daughter had walked into the storm and come back carrying a sentence that did not belong to either of them, and was using it now to offer him something he had not earned. He looked at the floor, then he moved aside and let her in. The sentence had closed one conversation and opened a different one in the same breath. And what grew between them afterward was not what had been there before, was not simple and was not easy, but was at least honest, which was more than either of them had managed. Before the winter of '83 showed them what their choices looked like at full scale. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always came, slow and suspicious, as though the mountains were not entirely convinced that winter had agreed to leave and were not prepared to commit to warmth until they had seen several consecutive days of evidence. Snow pulled back in patches on the south-facing slopes. Creeks shifted beneath their ice. The first green appeared where the sun lay longest tentative and very bright against the white. On the first warm day of April, Mave Tully came up the hill. She moved more slowly than she had in the autumn, and Varity went down to meet her halfway and took her arm for the last stretch, and they sat together at the cave entrance in the thin and watery sunlight and looked out at a valley where the snow was retreating and the first bare earth was showing in the low places. A hawk wheeled high above the ridge, the first bird Varity had marked in months, working the thermals with the effortless patience of a creature that has never once doubted its own ability to stay aloft. They watched it until it slid beyond the tree line and was gone. Mave opened the cloth sack she had carried up the slope and took out a handful of small paper envelopes. She pressed them into Verity's hands. "Tomato," she said, pointing to each one. "Bean, squash. This one I grew myself for 20 years and I want you to have it." Varity held the envelopes and felt their weight, which was almost nothing lighter than a held breath, and yet inside their paper walls lay the whole possibility of a future that was not only about enduring, but about producing, not only about lasting through the cold, but about raising something in the warmth that would outlast a single season. She had spent 3 months preparing for ruin. Now an old woman was asking her to prepare for growth. "Surviving is not only enduring," Mave said. "It is planting. You saved what was already here. Now make something new." Varity looked at the envelopes in her hands for a long time. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended, freighted with everything the winter had cost and everything it had given her. The bruised shoulders and the split knuckles, and the night Pearl stopped coughing, and every adult in the cave held their breath, and the 4 words June had spoken to her father, and the 5 words on a scrap of paper now folded in her coat pocket next to the lock of her father's hair. "Thank me in August when you have tomatoes," Mave said. Varity smiled. Not the careful half-expression she had rationed through the cold months, keeping her face neutral, because neutral was safer and warmer than hope. A full smile reaching her eyes, changing the whole shape of her face, making her look for one unguarded moment exactly what she was. She realized, sitting in the April light with the seed envelopes in her hands, that she did not know exactly when she had turned 18. Somewhere inside the blizzard, between the 5th person coming through the passage and the night Pearl stopped coughing, her birthday had passed without ceremony or acknowledgement, slipped by in the noise and the cold and the firelight without anyone knowing, herself included. She found that she did not mind. Birthdays were measurements, and she had learned this winter that the largest changes in a life kept no schedule and announced themselves to no one. She was 18. She had been 17 when she carried the first sack of potatoes up the slope in the dark, and she was 18 now, sitting in the sun with seeds in her hands. And what had happened between those two numbers was not a year, but an education that no year alone could have contained. 3 days later, Dorothy Vance came up the hill. Verity saw her from the ledge, a slight figure working the trail with careful steps, not hurrying, not struggling, simply climbing with the deliberate patience of a woman who has decided to do a thing and intends to finish it. Verity went down to meet her at the halfway point and took her arm for the last stretch without being asked, and they did not say anything to each other on the way up because nothing needed saying yet. At the entrance, Dorothy stopped and looked in. She stood in the opening for a long time, taking in the shelves and the banked fire and the raised sleeping platform and the marks on the eastern wall, the long column of tally marks and the diagram and the charcoal number written below everything else. 2 days. The count of what had remained when she chose to open the door for 12 people instead of keeping it for one. Then Dorothy looked at her daughter. Verity looked back. Dorothy stepped inside. She sat down on the edge of the sleeping platform and folded her hands in her lap. Not the tight, white-knuckled grip of the kitchen table months ago, but something looser, something that had released without disappearing entirely. She looked around the cave, the way a person looks at a place where something important happened that they were not present for and are trying to understand in retrospect. "You built all of this," she said. It was not a question, and it was not quite a statement. It was something in between, the sound of a person recalibrating the distance between what they assumed and what was actually true. "Somebody had to," Verity said. "Then after a moment, I learned from the person who built it before me." Dorothy nodded slowly. She did not ask who that was. She seemed to understand that the answer was larger than a name. They sat together in the cave for a while, the mother and the daughter, in the particular quiet of two people who have too much to say to begin anywhere specific and have decided wisely to let the silence do the early work. The fire kept its small, steady heat. Outside, the spring light moved across the valley below the same light that fell on the ridge and the road, and the house where Harlon Holt was learning to live with 3 words he had spoken in a kitchen doorway. When Dorothy finally rose to go back down, Verity walked her to the entrance and stood at the ledge and watched her begin the descent. Halfway down, Dorothy stopped and turned and looked back up. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply looked at her daughter standing at the mouth of the cave in the April light, and Verity looked back, and between them on the slope was the distance that remained, and the distance already crossed, and the understanding that the two were not the same thing and never would be, but that the crossing had begun. Dorothy turned and continued down the hill, and Verity watched her until the trail curved and the trees took her, and she was gone. It was enough. It was for now exactly enough. The cave stayed open year-round after that. People took to calling it Winter Keep, the name spreading through the valley the way good names spread, without anyone deciding, because it said what the place had become. A holding against the worst of things, raised by a girl the valley had written off, who had chosen to fill the empty space with something other than bitterness. Every autumn, when the geese flew south and the wind reversed, and the first hard frost killed the standing crops, someone climbed the hill to check it. Firewood stacked, shelves full, entrance clear. Because they remembered the winter of '83. Because they remembered what it looked like when one person prepared better than everyone else combined, and what she had done with that preparation when the storm arrived. On the first morning of true spring, Verity walked out before dawn to check her snares along the upper ridgeline. The snow had pulled back far enough that the trail was clear in most stretches, only a few shallow drifts remaining in the shadowed places where the sun had not yet reached. She was 20 yards from the cave entrance when she stopped. There, in the thin remaining white coming up from the tree line, and ending precisely where she stood, was a line of boot prints. Large boots. A long stride. The prints climbed the slope toward the cave, then stopped and turned and went back down toward the trees without ever reaching the entrance. Nothing left beside them. No rabbit on a branch, no coil of rope, no hatchet or square of deer hide. Only the prints coming up and turning back, as though the man who made them had walked up in the dark to see that the entrance was clear, that the stone above it still sheltered the girl who lived within, and then had turned and gone back to wherever he was going satisfied. She stood in the early light and looked at those prints for a long while. The hawk came back over the ridge or a different hawk and turned 3 slow circles above the slope and moved on. Then Verity went back inside. She took her father's folding knife from her coat pocket, the bone handle worn smooth where his thumb had rested against it 10,000 times. She crossed to the eastern wall where the tallies ran in their long column, the groups of 7 scratched deep into the stone by a man alone with a question he would carry for 30 years. She set the blade against the rock a few inches to the right of Ace's final mark. Separated by 3 decades in a small space of stone, but on the same wall in the same cave under the same chimney crack that had drawn fire smoke upward through the mountain for longer than anyone currently alive had been breathing. She cut one line, not a week's mark, not the beginning of a column, just one line clean and deliberate pressed into the stone with the knife her father had given her in the cave, that a stranger's knowledge had made survivable in the place that she had built with her own hands, and opened with her own choice, and intended to keep open against whatever winters were still coming. One line was enough. Counting was what a person did while waiting for something to end. Varity Vance was not waiting for anything to end. She was waiting for tomatoes, for the bean rows to come up, for the hawk to make another pass over the ridge, for the green to climb the southern slopes the way it climbed every year, slow and certain, and entirely indifferent to whatever the winter had thought it was doing. For the next person who would labor up this hill in the dark of some future winter and find the door against all the arithmetic of the world still standing open. She put the knife back in her pocket and walked out into the morning and sat down at the cave entrance with the valley spread below her and the seed envelopes in her coat and the spring light on the snow, and her face turned toward all of it open as a hand unclenched ready as ground that has been through the worst and is waiting now to be asked what it can grow.